How y'all doing? For those of y'all that don't know, my name is Carson Anderson. As the screen says, I lead the 7th grade boys. I was told not to embarrass them, so I'll try not to. I'll do my very best. But we're in this Choose Your Own Adventure series, right? This is our 3rd week. So what have we talked about the first 2 weeks? What was week 1? Man, middle schoolers. Logan spoke week 1. He told us that our relationship with God is not a formula, that each of us have a unique relationship with God, that we have to cater to our own personal selves, that we have to engage with God in our own way. Then last week, Justin spoke to us, and he told us about our relationships and our friendships and who we interact with, and how that's not only influential on us, but it's influential on them. So this today is talking about stories, because after we have this relationship with God, after we're careful about who we have relationships with, we need to know how to tell our story to them and the impact of our stories. So I felt if we're going to talk about stories, let me start with a story for tonight. And I'll start with a story from my life because that's what I know the best. So there's a picture in the slides of a time I went hiking. I'm at the very top in the bright green shirt. Because see, I'm not that smart. And I broke off from the group and I saw these things that looked like stairs. And I said, I should climb those. As it got harder to climb, as it got to the top, I was like, but I'm so close. So I made it all the way to the top. My group of friends found me. We stood there. We took a picture. But though I'm not afraid of heights, I am very afraid of falling. So I'm looking at this thing going back down. That's mighty steep. I barely made it up. I am not trying to go back down. So my alternative was, I'm going to just keep going up. I've seen people go up this rock face. I haven't seen anybody come back down it. Surely there's a safer way back down. So luckily, one of my buddies followed me up, and we started looking for this other path. And we kept going up, and the trail just kept going. And eventually it was like, we can't go any farther. There's people waiting for us on the other end. And I looked to my left, and there's a little trail. And to call it trail is really generous. There's a little path that animals used. And I was like, it looks like it goes down. Let's follow that. So I go down that, and we start going down, and it gets really steep. But we're fine. There's a lot of trees. I'm grabbing a tree, go to the next tree. One of those times I grab a tree, and the base of the tree is rotten. And by rotten, I mean the tree comes off completely in my hand. And I immediately start running down this mountain because there's nothing else we can do. I'm either running or falling. So I'm holding a tree in my hand, running down this mountain, and I'll look about from me to the booth away, and it's not a valley, but it's about a 15-foot drop into rocks. I can't jump over that. I promise you, I can't jump. Luckily, about 10 feet short, I grab another tree, I spin around, and I look up at my friend, and I'm staring up at him, and I'm just shaking. And I'm looking at him, and we both have the same feeling, man. That was crazy. That was exciting, and as soon as we got down, because luckily we got down safely and no one died, as soon as we got down, the first thing we did was we told that story. And I've told that story. It's been almost 2 years. I've told that story countless times because it's crazy. It's the closest I've ever come to death. It scared the absolute daylights out of me. So I told it multiple times because it was impactful to me. But the thing is, I've probably told that story more times since it's happened than I've told the story of my relationship with Christ. And so am I saying that the story of climbing this mountain was more impactful to my life than my conversion? Right? Because if it's impactful, we should be telling it. So we're going to look at 2 places in Scripture tonight of stories, of people who told stories, right? And how they allowed this influential moment of their life to become a testimony for them. So if y'all turn with me to Mark 5 real quick, if you have something to turn to. If not, it'll be on the screen. Might be a little different than what I'll be reading on the screen. I didn't get in here in time to change the slides and different translations. But I'm going to start with a little bit of summary because there's a lot of reading for tonight. So in Mark 5, at the very beginning, what we see are Jesus and the disciples crossing a sea. It's really a big lake. It's not much of a sea, honestly. But they're crossing the sea, and they get to the other side, and Jesus steps out the boat, and immediately they're confronted by a man. And the first thing we learn about this man is that this man is possessed by a demon. He lives in the caves, and what that means in this time is he lives in the tombs. He lives where people's dead bodies are buried outside the city. People have come from the city multiple times, and they've tried to chain him up. They've tried to stop him, but he is too strong, and he breaks the chains every time. So this man comes to Jesus. It says he's cut all over his body. He's got broken chains on him, and he's seething. He's angry. He's powerful. The people in this city are terrified of him. But the first thing he says to Jesus is, please don't cast me out. Because Jesus was telling him, get out of him, demon. And Jesus comes to him, and what we get here, picking up in Mark 5, right here in 14. Jesus has now come in and he asks the demon what's their name. And the demon says, "My name is Legion, because there are many of us." A legion is roughly 2,000 men. Could be up to 2,000 demons, you never know. This man is possessed by many demons. But he tells the demons to get out, and they go into a herd of pigs, and the herd of pigs goes into the water and dies. Now in verse 14, the men who tended the pigs ran off and reported it in the town and the countryside, and people went to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the man who had been demon-possessed sitting there, dressed, because he was naked before, and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs. They began to beg him to leave their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged him earnestly that he might remain with them. Jesus did not let him, but told him, "Go to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So he went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and they were all amazed. A little bit of context: the Decapolis were just 10 cities. Deca means 10, polis means cities. 10 Gentile cities, right? They had no access to God before this. They were no exposure. And this man now goes into these 10 cities and is sharing his story. But he's not the only one who shares his story in this story, right? Because the first people that share the story are the sheep herders, pig herders, right? They're the people that went and told them in the city and in the countryside, "Guys, there's a man of power here." Because these people knew the demon-possessed man. They knew the power that he had possessed because they tried to stop him. And now they're coming upon this man who had brought him back to his right mind, had him sitting there at his feet. They were terrified because they'd heard of his power. But the people that had told him of his power did not have a personal relationship to that power. Because if you see, the demon-possessed man leaves this place and he tells the same story, but the people he tells weren't terrified. They were all amazed, right? And that's important. All right, but we're going to go ahead and move on because we got one more to hit real quick. Go ahead to Acts 21. All right, in Acts 21, we're picking up with Paul. All right. Paul wrote most of the New Testament. If you haven't heard his name, we're going to get into his story right now. Because as I took a class on Paul last semester, and the way my professor worded it is every time I tell you Paul goes to a place, you should respond. And then a riot broke out. Because everywhere Paul went, the people were mad. And the same thing happened here. Paul's in Jerusalem, and some of the Jews there start stirring up trouble and tell them that he'd brought a Greek into the temple, which he had not done, but they just suspected he had done. And so a riot breaks out, and they're sitting there, and this crowd is beating Paul. But then the Roman guard shows up and arrests him so that they will stop beating him, and they're carrying him off. But when they get to where they've arrested him and taken him away from the crowd, Paul speaks to them in Greek. And the guards are taken aback, and they say, "Are you not the Egyptian that's stirring up riots?" He's like, "No, I'm a Greek man from a large city. Can I speak to the crowd?" They say, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So he steps up in front of the crowd, and he motions to them. And they all get quiet so they can hear what he's about to say. Then he speaks to them in Aramaic, which is the language that they speak. And the Bible says, and they hushed even more to listen to what he had to say. Right? Or Hebrew, depending on your translation. And he speaks to them, and this is what he says. He tells them of who he had been, that he had trained to be a Pharisee, that he had persecuted Christians, that he was one of the ones responsible for killing Christians. Right? This was one of his jobs. But then he tells them, starting in verse 6, "As I was traveling and approaching Damascus about noon, an intense light from heaven suddenly flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' He answered to me, 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, the one who you are persecuting.' Now those who were with me saw the light, but they did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I said, 'What should I do, Lord?' The Lord told me, 'Get up and go into Damascus, and there you'll be told everything that you have been assigned to do.' Since I could not see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and went into Damascus." Then he recounts how he met someone who led him into the city, a Christian who rightly should have been terrified of this man because this man had been killing Christians, but showed the grace of God to him and let him start a new life, a life to become a missionary to the Gentiles, people that had not been reached previously. And that's what Paul's most known for, is taking the gospel farther than it had ever gone. There's something also really significant about this story. It's what did Paul do to make the crowd be quiet? First, he waved his hands around, they hushed a little bit. But what really caught them off guard was when he spoke to them in their language. And I want to propose something to you. When you are telling your story, you are speaking in the language of your friends. If you have friends that aren't saved, that don't come to church, the Bible is not their language. The gospel, the story that you have grown up around or are experiencing here, that's not the language that they're used to. That's not the language that they'll respond most readily to. Paul spoke to them in their language, the language they spoke every day. And that's what you can do with your story. It's one of the reasons your story is so important, because you can engage people in their language and it'll let them listen easier. So we have a story. These guys had a story. So how do we go about telling it? Right, because that's important. If we're going to have a story, it's really important for us to know how to tell it. And the way I'm going to present it is a really simple 3-point method, a method that was used by Paul when he told his, and Mark when he told the account of Legion. And it starts with this. What was your life like before Christ? Right? We get an account of what Legion's life was like. He lived in the caves. He lived with dead bodies. People in town were terrified of him. He had a miserable existence. We know what Saul's life was like before Christ. Paul, back when he was Saul. He was persecuting Christians. He was raising up to be a grand Pharisee, right? He was killing Christians for their beliefs. We know what their lives were like. The second point, how did God get your attention? We know how God got Legion's attention. Jesus showed up. That's enough to get a demon's attention. They knew who he was. That was enough. And Paul very clearly says how his attention was gathered. He was riding on the road to Damascus, and all of a sudden he was blinded by a light so bright that he couldn't see for 3 days. Right? And he heard a voice that said to him very clearly, I am Jesus Christ, who you are persecuting. And then finally, what does your life look like after Christ? What does it look like now? Because if your life has not changed, what's the experience? Right? What's the interaction with Christ? What did he bring you out of if you're still in it? Right? We see how Legion's life has changed, or the guy who was formerly Legion. It doesn't ever give us a name. He goes into the Decapolis. He's no longer terrorizing the citizens of these cities. He's going to them. He's preaching to them. He's ministering to them. He's telling them about Jesus Christ before anyone else will. And they're all amazed at what he's telling them. Right? He's giving them the gift of life. We know how Paul's life has changed. Paul goes from persecuting Christians to being one of the spearhead Christian leaders of the time. He goes from being over the beatings and stonings to being beaten, being stoned, being shipwrecked, until eventually he's executed while he's in prison. Because his life has changed. And your story are not like these people's stories in one way, significant. Your story is not finished. All right? That's something that's you're going to have to work through for the rest of your life, is where am I at in my story? Because it's easy to tell the story of Paul. The story of Paul is done. Paul is dead. It's harder to tell the story of you a little bit because you have to constantly gauge where you are. But that's important. You have to recognize, yes, I was brought here at this point, but now I'm being brought here, right? When I was first saved, God brought me out of this, but now God's bringing me out of this and into something new, right? Paul didn't become a religious leader in one day. He spent months, if not years, relearning everything he knew. He didn't have this whole testimony when he was first saved. Your story is something that constantly transforms. It constantly changes, right? It evolves as your life has continued to be worked into. But it's something that you still need to be sharing. You can't wait till the end of your life to share your story, because then you won't be around to share it. Right? When your story is done, you can't share it anymore. All right? And I really want to, for a second, talk about 5 reasons why we share our story. Right? We have the what, our story. We have the how. Now we need to talk about the why. First reason, because somebody needs to hear it. I would say that as a Christian, Justin really got into a lot of this last week a little bit. A, you should have people around you that are non-believers that you can be witnessing to. And B, you have to be sharing your story. Guys, if we're not sharing our story, if we're not sharing what Christ has done in our life, if we're not sharing what he has done for us, then we are failing. The last thing God said to his disciples before he left this earth was go and make disciples, not go and sit and look like a Christian. And I'm saying this because that's what I did. Middle and high school, they know I'm a Christian. They know that I've made that clear enough to them. I don't need to do anymore. They see how I live my life. I've said I'm a Christian. That's all that needs to happen, but that is wrong. And there are people I will always regret for the rest of my life not talking to because I can't talk to them anymore. I don't know how to get in contact with them. I've left there. I don't have cell phone numbers. And that will be regrets I live with for the rest of my life, that I did not share my story with them because I just hope they get it by being around me. We can't do that. There are people that need to hear your story. I don't care if you think it's boring. I thought my story was boring. I was saved at 9. I wasn't in a gang. I wasn't doing crazy stuff. I didn't get brought about anything spectacular. Most of the things I've been brought up out of came about after my salvation. But it's still something that needs to be heard. And I assure you, I learned this as we did stories at camp when I worked 2 years ago. No matter how boring or how basic you think your story is, there's always someone that can relate to it and always someone that needs to hear it. Because there's someone that's going through the exact same stuff. Right? God is perfect. God has not put people around you carelessly. God has put people around you that need to hear what you're going through. So we need to share it with them. Secondly, because sharing makes things clearer. All right. You might know something, but do you know it well enough to say it? You might know something, but do you know it well enough to put it on a test? You ever been taking a test and the answer is just on the tip of your tongue, but you can't write it down? Because that happens to me in all my tests. That's why. That means you don't really know it as well as you could. And when you have to speak about your story, when you sit down and you actively tell it, you know it better. When you take the time to put it into words and say, this is what happened and this is how it happened, your story becomes clearer to you. So that you can grow in knowing, man, Christ really did this for me. This is what has been happening in my life. This is how Christ has moved me. Third, because sharing your story makes you more grateful. Guys, how can we be grateful for what God has brought us out of if we're not recognizing it? Right? We just talked about how it makes it more clear. It just makes it all the more clear how God has been faithful to us, how God has been good to us, how God has given us so much more than we deserve, how we are sinners who do not deserve His grace, but He's giving it anyway. He's constantly giving us more chances, and He's helping us through things that we don't deserve. It makes us more grateful as we talk about our story, as we understand that. 4, because it makes you brave. Some people would probably say, sharing your story is really not a big deal. It's fine. I've heard it so many times minimalized, saying, why don't you share your faith with your friend? It's no big deal. Like, so what if they don't want to be friends with you anymore? It's not a big deal, right? It's eternity on the line. But that's not true. Guys, sharing your story is a huge deal. Putting yourself out there is no small thing. I understand that. When you're risking friendships because you don't know how they're going to respond, that's a huge deal. That's a big thing. It's not something that you should minimize. It's something you should recognize. This is an act that I'm taking, and I'm taking it intentionally, and you have to be brave in it. Once you share that story, there's not really any going back. And a lot of that element can be, especially if it's in a smaller group, part of sharing your story should probably really intentionally be sharing what God has brought you out of. Like, very intentionally to a person, this is what I struggled with, but God saved me from that. And that can be hard. That can be extremely hard because sometimes it feels like you're the only one that's done it. You're the only one who's had this problem. You're the only one who got struggled in something for so long. But you're not. You're not the only one. And the only way you're going to find that out is by sharing it. Because it's scary. It's terrifying to open yourself up to people. It's something you have to be brave for, but it's something with rewards that are unmatched. And finally, because sharing your story makes you grow. As we're able to see our story more clearly, as we're able to be more grateful, as we're able to go out and share our story with people, we're growing. Right? And that's becoming part of our story as we're growing. But we're growing, right? Because that's what this whole story has been, is how do we use these things to grow? That's this whole series. And sharing your story is one of those things that you might think you're just doing it for other people. You're not. It benefits you as well. And it not only benefits you by you understanding and you telling, but what you'll hear back. Right? Because what you'll find is that if you're open with someone, they're much more likely to be open with you. Right? If you share, this is what's happened in my life, they're likely to pour right back into you. And there is no better system for growing with someone in Christ than two people or more being open with each other, building each other up, and talking about what Christ has done. Your story isn't done yet. It's still going. Every day you live, your story changes a little bit. But where you're at right now is important. Because there is only the present. The future never gets here, because by the time it gets here, it's the present. You can never say, I'll do it one day, because you won't. You'll never do it. The reason that this is the most important time to share your story is because it's right now. And there is no better time to do it than right now. No matter how incomplete you think your story is, someone still needs to hear it. No matter how troubled, how terrible you think your story is, someone can relate. Someone needs to hear your story. Who is it? And what are you going to do about it? Pray us out. Dear Lord, thank you so much for giving us stories. God, thank you so much for being willing to save us out of sin. God, to free us from the corruption that we've caught ourselves in. God, I pray that you'll make us brave. I pray that you'll make us bold. God, I pray that you will help us identify the people who need to be told our stories. God, and I pray that you will help us tell them. Because it is not our words, God, that fulfill your mission. You use our words, but God, it's your message. And I pray that through these students here tonight, your message will be taught throughout so many groups of people. God, throughout school districts, God, throughout schools that just come together, homeschoolers that come together. God, I pray that you will share this story all across Charleston just from this room right here. I pray these things in your name. Amen.